So I used the Sony A7V exclusively for my recent trip to Japan, so I had a lot of time to figure out, is the Sony A7V actually worth the upgrade from the Sony A7IV, or is it better to just save your money? Today, we're going to figure that out. Now it might be hard to tell because their body style is pretty similar, but this is actually the Sony A7IV. Now I was using the A7V for Japan. That was actually a loaner from Sony that was sent to me. I have returned it, no money was exchanged hands, so it was not a sponsored thing. They did not even expect me to make a video on the A7V. It was literally just a loaner for me to test out and see if I like it. Now there's a bunch of spec differences. I'll talk about a little bit of like the important ones in a second, but most of this is not going to be just spec reading, you can just find that online. It's going to be my actual experience with the Sony A7V and see what I think about it. I'm going to be covering what I like about the Sony A7V and what I dislike about it, and this is going to be in no particular order. So let's start off with what I like about it. So the Sony A7IV was released in 2021, so it's been about 5 years, so it does have a lot of the older features and none of the newer features that the new cameras have. So the Sony A7V has 7.5 stops of stabilization, up from I believe 5.5 stops, which I noticed a little bit, but I think the bigger thing that I noticed is that the Sony A7V has the ability to use dynamic active stabilization, which the Sony A7IV doesn't. This is really useful because in Japan, we obviously don't want to bring as much gear, so we didn't want to carry around a gimbal for those smooth shots. So using the dynamic active stabilization, we were actually able to get a lot of handheld shots just walking, and it was actually really smooth. Now one thing I do want to know about the dynamic active stabilization is that it usually only works better if you're doing a horizontal movement and you're not turning side to side. So I noticed that when you're moving horizontally, it's super smooth, it looks like a gimbal, and the results are actually really good. But as soon as you turn a little bit side to side, the dynamic active stabilization tries to correct it a little bit too much, and you can see it shifting and trying to correct it, and it's a very jarring movement. So I do recommend that if you're trying to use dynamic active stabilization, the shot needs to be like one continuous movement. You can't be turning side to side a lot, or it's going to make a lot of jitters. However, I found that if you do this and then add a little bit of stabilization afterwards in post-production, then the results are actually still really good. It's just something that you need to be aware of. You can't just turn on dynamic active stabilization for every single shot and just hope that the results will come out perfect. You also need to keep in mind that it does do a pretty heavy crop, so if you're using a tighter focal length, it will be a lot harder to use because you'll be cropping in even more. I also found that the dynamic active stabilization, like I mentioned, if you're shaking a little too much side to side, it will cause more jitters. If you're using a longer focal length, there's more of a chance that you're going to do that side to side and it's going to be more noticeable, and that's where the dynamic active stabilization tries to correct it a little bit too much. So it definitely is something that I found works a lot better with wider lenses. That's one thing that I really wish that the Sony A7IV had. Now the second thing I like is that when you're shooting S Log3 for video, the second base ISO is 8000, up from 3200 on the A7IV. Now this is a really big jump, and I'm actually really impressed at how they did it. On the Sony FX3 that I'm filming on right now, the second base is 12,800, and normally you're able to get really good low light performance if you have really low megapixels. So on the FX3, it's a 12 megapixel camera and your second base ISO is 12,800. On the Sony A7V, your second base is 8000, which is not too far from 12,800, but you're getting 33 megapixels, which is a huge jump up from 12 megapixels. So it's actually really impressive how they're able to do that. It gives me hope for the Sony FX3 Mark II. Maybe they're able to up the megapixels up to like maybe 24 megapixels, but still keep the 12,800 second base ISO, or maybe even a little bit higher. So that's actually really cool to see. Now obviously 3200 ISO as a second base is nothing to scoff about, it's actually really good still, but when you switch to the second base ISO on the Sony A7IV, normally I would have to take off my ND filter because 3200 ISO is not high enough for me to keep my ND filter on. But on the Sony A7V, because 8000 is so high, I can still keep the ND filter on, which means that if I'm shooting indoors, I can keep the ND filter on, bump to 8000 ISO, and still have it on and not have to worry about taking it off. And then when I step back outside, I just push my ISO back down to 800 and I don't have to take off the ND filter as well. So it's just really nice to be able to keep the ND filter on but still jump between indoors and outdoor shooting. The third thing I like is more of like a quality of life upgrade. So on the Sony A7IV, you're able to turn on the Gamma Display Assist, and this is where it turns your S Log3 footage, gives you a Rec 709 look on the monitor. It does not do it in post-production, so your files are still going to be S Log3, but it just lets you see what you're looking at in a Rec 709 color space a little bit easier. but on the Sony A7V, it's very much like my FX3 where I can upload my own LUTs to it, which I prefer. A little trick that I've been doing with the Sony A7V is that when I made my own LUTs to put into the camera, I actually underexposed the LUTs by 2 stops, which means that when I put it into the A7V, it's already underexposed by 2 stops. Normally with S Log3 footage, you want to overexpose by 2 stops, and that works well, but when you're looking at the back of the screen, it's a little bit hard to tell how your image will actually look like because it's going to be overexposed by 2 stops. So my trick with the LUTs is that when I underexpose it by 2 stops, in the camera, I don't have to overexpose it by 2 stops, I just have to expose it perfectly, exactly how I want it. But then when I put it into post-production, the files are still overexposed by 2 stops because the LUTs don't actually affect the footage, it just affects how I look at it, which makes it really easy to expose for S Log3. Now the fourth thing I like is the screen. So I started out as a photographer, I do a lot of photos, and this flip style vlog screen is not what I prefer for photos. Yes, this is great for when you're vlogging and you're able to turn around and look at yourself, but for photos, I don't like having the flip out screen. I prefer the old style tilt out screen where it just tilts up and I can just look at it that way. Now obviously this is Sony A7IV, so I can't really show it to you, but on the Sony A7V, they have the new Vary screen. And this is the one where you can tilt it up and down, or you can flip it out and be a vlog style screen. And that's actually really cool because in photos, I can just flip it up. In video, I can flip out the screen and vlog, so I get the best of both worlds. Now at first I was a little bit skeptical because with so many moving parts, it does look like it might be a little bit flimsy, but it's actually really solid. I would argue that maybe even more solid than this screen here. It just feels really robust. Now, do you need that screen to be able to get good photos? Obviously not, but it just is really nice to be able to have both options depending on what you prefer. Now, a little spec bump for the A7V is that the Sony A7IV does a cropped 4K 60 and only 120 frames per second at 1080p. On the Sony A7V, it does a uncropped 4K 60 as well as a cropped 4K 120. So that's actually a really big spec bump. You're able to get 4K across the board. Obviously you do have that little bit of a crop with the 4K 120 where with my FX3 you don't have the cropped 4K 120, but obviously it's going to be a hybrid camera, so they have to put some limitations in it. But honestly, the crop doesn't bother me as much. I really like that it's 4K across the board. Now one thing to note is that I didn't really talk about image quality, and that's because I don't think there's much of a difference between the Sony A7IV and the Sony A7V in terms of image quality. They're both going to be 33 megapixels. Now the Sony A7V does have that partially stacked sensor, which means that you're going to get a little bit of less rolling shutter. I don't think I really noticed it too much. However, I'm most of the time not doing any like drastic whip pans, stuff like that, so I don't really think that matters much to me. So I think if you're purely looking for the Sony A7V as a quality upgrade, there's no point, you might as well just keep the Sony A7IV. Now the last thing I liked about the Sony A7V is I don't actually know if they changed anything internally, but with the Sony A7IV, it tends to overheat in video. So if I'm doing long recordings like using the A7IV as my talking head camera, what I'm doing right now, or let's say I'm setting it up on a tripod to shoot a wedding ceremony and just leaving a recording, oftentimes I would actually put a third-party fan on the back of the camera right here. It would just slide on because it tends to overheat. And that's already at 4K 30. If you're shooting 4K 60, it's definitely going to get a lot hotter really fast. With the Sony A7V, again, I don't know if they actually changed anything internally because I don't believe that it still has a fan, but the internals seemed a lot cooler. I didn't feel any overheating or even the body getting warm where the Sony A7IV tends to do sometimes. I'm thinking maybe they just made something a little bit more efficient with the processor and it just keeps the internals a lot cooler, but that was actually a really welcome sight. Before we continue, you probably noticed that we have this anamorphic look going on right here for my talking head. I'm really curious to know if you prefer this style of talking head or if you prefer I just go back to my old style. Now something that I kind of liked and disliked about the Sony A7V is that the Sony A7V has the new AI tracking features. So right now the Sony A7IV can only track faces and eyes of people and just birds and stuff as well. But then with the Sony A7V, it has the AI tracking, so you can set a bunch of different parameters. So you can make it track on people, birds, cars, planes, animals, all of that. So instead of just tracking only the face and the eyes, there's actually a box that goes around the whole subject. So it's able to track that. That's really nice. It just gives the autofocus a little bit of an upgrade. But there was a downside to it. I didn't record my screen, so I'm not able to exactly show this to you, but I'm going to try my best to explain this. So when I was taking a photo of this specific car, I was using the spot focus, so I'll put it on the screen here. This point was exactly where I was focusing on, and you can see that it's nowhere near the car in the foreground, it's perfectly on the car in the background. And I expected the AI autofocus to be able to focus on the car in the background. But for some reason, the AI tracking kept trying to focus on the car in the front. It was really weird, the box kept showing up on the front, even though the spot focus is nowhere near that car. And no matter what I did, it kept trying to focus on the car in the foreground. So how I got these shots was I actually had to switch to manual focus and then focus on the car in the background manually. And that's actually happened a couple of times where it tries to focus on something that's nowhere near where I'm actually trying to focus on. So sometimes it does seem like it has like a mind of its own and it's a little bit harder to control. This has always been my gripe with autofocus. Yes, it's super convenient for a lot of scenarios, but that's why with a lot of video, especially when I'm rigging it out, I prefer to just shoot in manual focus because I want to be able to control exactly where I focus on. Now another thing that's kind of annoying with the Sony A7V is that they seem to have kind of like rolled back the firmware with third-party batteries. Now I've been using these two third-party batteries mostly. This is the Lano one and then this is the Tilta one. Now I know a lot of people are going to say don't use third-party batteries, just stick with the first-party ones. That might have been true when people first started using third-party batteries, but now these are all safe. They've been like highly manufactured, so I don't see any problem with using third-party batteries. But on the Sony A7V, it does seem like they kind of rolled back the firmware where if you put in a third-party battery, it has that pop-up where it says that this battery isn't compatible, do you still want to use it? And it also doesn't show the battery percentage of the third-party batteries. Now my Sony A7IV has no problem with that, my FX3 has no problem with that, so it does seem like it's only with the A7V they've done something where it doesn't recognize these third-party batteries anymore, which is kind of annoying. Is it a deal breaker? Not really, but it's just something that I had to get used to again because you have to specifically click OK on that pop-up that pops up, where with the Sony A7IV and FX3, you don't have to do that anymore. Honestly, with the Sony A7V, there's not much else that I really disliked about it. I actually had a ton of fun using it in Japan, but the question is it actually worth the upgrade from the Sony A7IV? For me, these are my thoughts. With the Sony A7IV, it was never truly a hybrid camera for me. Because you have that cropped 4K 60 and you have that 1080p for 120 frames per second and you just have that lower second base ISO at 3200, I never really wanted to use it as much as a pure hybrid camera, so the A7IV to me was just my photography camera. And if I wanted to shoot hybrid, I actually took up my Sony FX3. I like the video specs a lot more and I was okay with giving up the 33 megapixels in trade of the 12 megapixels that the Sony FX3 has. But with the Sony A7V, I actually think that it's probably one of the best hybrid cameras that I've used so far. You finally get that 33 megapixels that I couldn't get from my 12 megapixel FX3, but you're getting a lot of those videos, features, and spec bumps. So you get the 8000 ISO, which is a lot closer to 12800 ISO and a lot higher than 3200 ISO. You're getting custom LUTs that we never had on the Sony A7IV. You're getting the better stabilization with the dynamic active stabilization. And to me, those are features that I really like and the reason why I choose the Sony FX3 over my A7IV as my hybrid camera. Now I'm still on the fence about if I want to sell the Sony A7IV for the Sony A7V. The reason is where I am, the Sony A7IV sells used for about $2,000 and the Sony A7V new is about $4,000, a little bit higher than that. So if I sell the Sony A7IV, I still need to drop $2,000 for the Sony A7V. And to me, it's like, do I really want to do that when I have the FX3 and the Sony A7IV? Do I really need to replace this for a camera that does everything when I already have two cameras at my disposal? To me, I don't know if I want to do that, so I'm still on the fence. But I think that if Sony A7IV is your only camera right now and you want to use it as a hybrid camera, the Sony A7V is actually a pretty big upgrade from the Sony A7IV. Or if you're looking for your first hybrid camera, I think skip the Sony A7IV, you're going to be a lot happier with the Sony A7V in my opinion. So I'm very curious to know, have you used the Sony A7V and do you think it's a worthy upgrade to the Sony A7IV? Let me know down in the comments below. Like always, if you have any questions about the Sony A7V, something you want to know, just let me know down in the comments below. Again, I used the Sony A7V exclusively for 2.5 weeks in Japan, so I had a lot of time just shooting with it over and over and getting really familiar with it. So if there's anything you want to know, let me know. If you like this video, remember to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to see more photo video content, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.